Jim Bridger, Part 8. That Bridger impressed everyone with whom he came in contact by his quiet deportment and utter lack of everything smacking of display or braggadocio is further evidenced in a letter to Shotwell from an old friend close to 90 years of age, now living in the far northwest. Shotwell does not divulge the name of this friend, but gives the authors the following extract from the letter regarding Bridger. He was the one man of the time that I never heard anything but good spoken of. I knew scores of hunters, scouts, and trappers of great and less repute, none of whom were worthy to sit at the same table with Jim Bridger. To me, the simplicity, gentleness, kindness, and absolute truthfulness of his character marked him as a man above the common. And while as an Indian trader he doubtless availed himself of his knowledge, chances, and opportunities, yet there wasn't an Indian on the overland trail that doubted Bridger's word. My first few weeks at Fort Laramie seemed like a dream, so strange was all around me, and you may be sure I took note of all about me. Indians in their blankets of gaudy colors, hunters and trappers in their buckskin suits with beaded shirts and decorated headgear were all of intense interest to me, but there was another figure that soon claimed my attention, a tall, well-built man in plain civilian garb, with nothing in his makeup to mark him apart from men as they appeared back east. A man who quietly went his way and seemed foreign to all about him. But I noticed that the officers at the post, as well as all the scouts and hunters, paid him marked deference. So much did this come under my notice that in time my curiosity prompted me to ask who was this strange, quiet man, and imagine my surprise on being told that this was Jim Bridger, the greatest of scouts in his time. A man who, to use a trite saying, knew the Rocky Mountain country like a book. A man invaluable to the government. A man consulted on all important military movements, in fact, an oracle in all that pertained to the vast country surrounding. This was my first insight into Bridger. An Army man whose duties brought him much in personal contact with Bridger was Captain Lee Humphreyville, an old cavalry officer who in 1899 wrote a book entitled 20 Years Among Our Hostile Indians. In his mention of Jim Bridger, he says, James Bridger, or as he was familiarly spoken of in that country, old Jim Bridger, was the most efficient guide, mountaineer, plainsman, trapper, and Indian fighter that ever lived in the far west. He knew more of that country and all things within its borders than anyone who's ever lived. He could, with the aid of a stick, scratch on the ground a map of the whole western country that was more correct than those made at that time by skilled topographical engineers with all their scientific instruments. I have seen Bridger look at a printed map and point out its defects at sight. His experience in that country was not confined to a few tribes of Indians, but to all. He was a marvelous trailer, unquestionably the most expert that ever lived. Even with old and with dimmed eyesight, he could run a trail when mounted as fast as his horse could carry him. He noticed every feature of the country, especially its configuration, and possessing as he did a retentive memory, he could invariably recall all landmarks with unerring accuracy, even though he had not seen them for years. He was much respected by Army officers and by the authorities at Washington, as well as by all whites with whom he came in contact. The Indians also learned to fear and respect him. Whenever an important military expedition was planned, Bridger's services were secured whenever possible. Bridger was an old man when I last saw him, about 76 years of age and a great sufferer from goiter, brought on by long use of snow water. He was also badly ruptured, and I could scarcely understand how he rode a horse at all. Yet with all his bodily infirmities, he was cheerful and ready to do valiant service at any time. The government appreciated his services so much that he frequently received $25 per day with rations, horse, arms, and quarters while in its service. It was Bridger who first brought Kit Carson to the notice of General John C. Fremont, I have seen Carson take his orders from Bridger as a soldier does from his commanding officer. Bridger was much sought after by immigrants crossing the plains, for his reputation as a guide and Indian fighter was well known. The pilgrims annoyed him with all sorts of questions, which often compelled the old man to beat a retreat, yet he had a streak of humor and gave them a ghost story now and then. He could reel off story after story with astonishing spontaneity. He told these stories with a solemn gravity that was intensely amusing. I know that I am largely indebted to Bridger for often keeping my spirits up when they were at a low ebb. I always knew something good was coming when he began to tell a story, but never dared to smile until the climax was reached, for that would have spoiled it all. On a visit to Washington, he was introduced to the president. After staring at him in amazement for a few minutes, Bridger turned to the member of Congress who had introduced him and remarked, "Looks just like any other man, don't he?" While his trading post at Fort Bridger flourished, he was supposed to have a considerable sum of money in his possession. Some desperados broke into his room one night for the purpose of robbing him. Bridger, awakening from his sleep, demanded, "What air you looking for?" One of the desperados replied, "We are looking for your money." Bridger observed, "Just wait a minute and I'll get up and help you." The robbers did not wait. I occupied the same quarters with him one whole winter, where I had ample opportunity to study his character and learn his peculiar ways and manner of living. He never did anything until he felt so inclined. For instance, if he grew sleepy in the afternoon, say by 3, 4, or 5 o'clock, he went to bed. And when he awoke, say in 4, 5, or 6 hours, he would arise, make a fire, roast meat, eat it, and sing Injun, to use his own term, the rest of the night. If he had a tin pan, he would beat on the bottom, making a noise like an Indian tom-tom. He never ate until he was hungry, and as he lived largely on meats, he was thin and spare, though strong and wiry. His manner of living during the winter did not coincide with my habits or ideas by any means, so I tried to entertain him afternoons and keep him awake until 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening. My first effort was a reading to him. A copy of Hiawatha was found among the troops, which I read to him as long as he permitted it. He would sit bent over, his long legs crossed, his gaunt hands and arms clasping his knees, and listen to the reading attentively until a passage was reached in which Longfellow portrayed an Indian. When Bridger, after a period of uneasy wiggling on his seat, arose very wrathy, swearing that the whole story was a lie, that he would listen to no more of it, and that no such Indian ever lived. This happened over and over again. After a while, I quieted him and began to read again, but after a short time he was sure to stop me, swearing that he would not listen any longer to such an infernal lie. During that winter, Bridger's suit of buckskin clothing, and it was all he had, became infested with vermin, and in despair he at length asked me how he could get rid of them. I told him if he would take off his buckskin jacket and breeches and wrap himself in a buffalo robe, I would undertake to rid his clothes of the pest. He thereupon took his clothing off and turned it inside out. After spreading the garment on the ground, I poured a ridge of gunpowder down the seams of the suit and touched it off. It burned the vermin, and it also burned the buckskin clothing badly. On the seams of the leggings I had sprinkled so much powder that it burned the garments to charred leather. They were drawn up short at the seams, and after being turned, each leg curled up until it looked like a half moon. Bridger looked at me for a moment in great disgust, and then with a big oath said, "I am a-going to kill you for that." I was afraid he would make his threat good, for he was certainly very indignant. I laughed at him, and taking hold of the leggings, I stretched them into the best shape possible, but the leather was burned to brittleness and broke at the slightest touch. Bridger did not forgive me for this for 2 or 3 days, during which time he was compelled to go about in a buffalo robe until another buckskin suit could be procured. An instance of Bridger's courage happened under my own observation. While scouting in the South Park, he was our guide. We also had with us some Arapaho Indians and a white man who had an Arapaho wife. After sharp engagement with a war party of Indians who greatly outnumbered us, we were compelled to withdraw to the hillside. As soon as the Indians saw our position, a number of warriors dismounted and hid themselves in the bushes and tall grasses. From this concealment, they began firing upon us. I did not consider it advisable for the time being to separate the command and send a party to charge into the ambush. Bridger all this time was growing restless, and at last challenged one of the Arapaho allies to go into the copse with him and attack the Indians hand to hand. The Arapaho refused, and Bridger abused him soundly by means of the sign language. The Indian at last grasped Bridger by the hand, and the two started. It was not long before I heard the report of a six-shooter, and in a few minutes Bridger returned holding in his hand the scalp of a warrior, covered with warm blood. He had found an Indian in the brush, and before the latter had time to move, had killed him. The Arapaho not returning, I was satisfied that his career was ended, or that a worse fate was in store for him. I determined to burn the tall, dry grass and ordered the white man who had the Indian wife to send one of the Arapaho Indians to set it on fire. They all refused until Bridger ridiculed them so unmercifully that the whole party accompanied him, and the grass was fired. It burned rapidly, and it was not long until the fierce flames disclosed a great many Indians hidden in the underbrush. When the command opened fire upon them, they ran in every direction, but soon returned with their mounted warriors, ready to resume the fight. Bridger insisted that under no circumstances must we leave our present position, as there were at least 2 or 3 Indians to one of us. In a short time they made an attack, but we had the advantage of high ground and could anticipate their every movement. Bridger picked off the first Indian who got within range of his deadly rifle, and the best shots among the troopers also used their Spencer carbines with effect. The Indians were thus prevented from getting near us, and after a few hours of this kind of fighting, they withdrew. End of chapter.